Okay, everybody, this is Ryan Scott here. I don't have any idea if this is going to work. I am driving up the New York State Thruway right now. Being 40 years old, I rarely remember that I could take pictures or video at a moment's notice. I never think to do so. I was alive at a time before all this stuff. So when I drive on a long drive like this, I often listen to podcasts. Some of them are just, newsy, superfluous sorts of things. Some of them get me thinking. And then when I start thinking, I have to pause the podcast, and then I start talking to myself out loud. This is how I develop thoughts. This is how I kind of work through my own thinking on things. And I realized that I could just record this, and then I would have it for posterity if, in fact, it's worth anything. And so I've been working for a while with this notion of reinterpreting the scriptural understanding of the fall, in terms of our first sin and how we deal with sin. And I had a little bit of a breakthrough in part of this argument today. So I want to go through that and talk about what that means. And so the traditional interpretation is simply that God designed us to be faultless, and that at some point our first parents, Adam and Eve, in the scriptures, sinned and screwed that up, and that's called the fall. And then the repercussions of that imperfection have sort of been passed down to us throughout all the ages. I've never really been satisfied with that explanation. I am willing to state and take this sort of radical notion that I believe sin and human failure was always part of God's plan for this world. That might be heretical to some. And honestly, practically, if you don't like that assertion, most of what I have to say is still going to be applicable to you. Because the reality is we live in a world where humans are faulty. We are sinful, we screw up, we are imperfect, we have lots of faults. And so this is still talking about how we deal with that world. But I will just mention the reason that I think that this was always a part of God's plan is one, essentially because of Jesus. What is the point of an incarnation? What is the point of God becoming one of us? Essentially to show us how to be human, if not for failure, right? Because any fault we have is sin. Any time we fail to be truly human or who we were created to be, we have sinned. And that's really the definition of this, is anytime we are not a human as we are intended to be, it is a failure. So if we were always supposed to be faultless, what would be the point of God becoming one of us? We wouldn't need to be shown how to be human because we'd already be doing it. The second reason that I think that this is true, and I should mention before I get too far, I do think that there was a fall. There was a moment in which humanity did something God did not intend us to do. And that is in that same story in Adam and Eve, is when God searches for Adam after he has sinned. And Adam is hiding. He says, I've done something wrong. I'm ashamed of it. And so I was hiding from you. And I think this failure to reconcile or to seek reconciliation is really the fall. This is what has cascaded down through the generations and compounded to make the world, all of the badness that exists here, right? God sought reconciliation after that sin, after it was proved that humans had faults and failures. God wanted to love us and to reconcile and to move on from that. And our first human shied away from that and rejected that. And ultimately, it is that reconciliation that is the second reason that I feel like God always intended sin to be a part of this. Because the image at the end of the Bible, I think, is much more beautiful than the one at the beginning. We have this picture of the Garden of Eden, of a faultless creation, which is a beautiful image, and I'm not saying it isn't. But I think the image at the end of a God who has endured all of the traumas that we have inflicted on this world and continues to love us. A God who recreates the heaven and the earth and comes down out of this perfect heaven to embody and live among God's people, as sinful as we may have been. That picture of reconciliation is far more beautiful to me than one of faultlessness. And I love the analogy. I think it's a Japanese art form, certainly an Asian art form called kintsugi.
And this is where you take broken pottery and put it back together. But instead of trying to put it back together in a seamless way where it looks like it was before it was broken, you reconnect it using gold or silver or some sort of precious metal, and so that you could see all of where the cracks were. And so what was the fault and the failure and the mistake becomes part of the art, which makes it beautiful. And I would say even more beautiful than that piece of pottery was at the beginning. And so this picture of reconciliation, this notion that we can still be loved in spite of our faults, to me is much, much more beautiful than any sort of notion of faultlessness. And so I think that human life is constantly a movement forward. So many people would say that we're trying to get back to the Garden of Eden, and that is what God intended. And I don't think that's true. God created the Garden of Eden, but I believe that is just a starting point to get us to this image at the end of Scripture, this future in which there is nothing but reconciliation. And sort of the revelation that I had today that I've been working through was an analogy, really, and that is the notion, excuse me, the notion that just because we're changing priority and maybe deprioritizing something, that somehow that is devalued, right? So if we're saying that maybe this notion of avoiding sin is something that we're moving away from the priority. That has been the priority of Christian life for a long time. I don't think that just moving it out of priority is devaluing it. And sort of the revelation for me was thinking about education today. And that was what the podcast I was listening to talked about, and that's why I was thinking about it. For a long time, I think people would say that the priority in education, the purpose, was knowledge acquisition. That you were trying to get as much information into somebody's brain as you possibly could, because the more knowledge they had, the better off they were going to be in life. And I think that was true for a long time. It may still be true for a lot of people. But the reality is, I think that we're changing our priority in education. And much more important than knowledge acquisition is teaching how to learn. Right? You want in education, you want your student to learn how to learn, and also to be instilled with a desire to keep doing it. Because then, beyond even what you have to teach them, they can continue to learn through the rest of life. And that doesn't devalue the acquisition of knowledge. But what you're doing is actually enabling them to acquire more knowledge over time on their own, instead of just having the priority of putting it into their head. And so what I would say in Christian life and Christian ethics, and I really want to run this by some people who have a lot more training and thinking about this, but what we're doing is for so many people, Christian life is about trying to be perfect. It's about trying to be faultless. It's about avoiding all of these poor choices and mistakes and intentional sin, whatever that might be. And even if you're not religious, right? This notion of trying to be better, I'm trying to be good, I'm striving to be faultless, has often been the priority for people. And what I would argue, if ultimately reconciliation is the goal down the line, that we would prioritize instead loving faulty people, loving people who do the wrong thing, who make mistakes. If our priority is not avoiding the mistakes, but loving the people who make them, I think that radically changes what life means. First of all, it's a positive thing, right? That we are promoting reconciliation. And yes, it might downplay maybe the importance of mistakes, but if mistakes are necessary, as I really believe they are, what this is doing is putting them in their proper place. And it's not to say that our sins and our mistakes and our failures are good, because they cause harm to people, right? And that's not a good thing. And I don't think God wishes whatever harm has happened to you or whatever harm you have caused. But I do think the value of reconciliation, the value of being loved in spite of those failures and in spite of those faults and in spite of that harm that you've created, being loved in spite of that is far, far more beautiful, far more important, far more meaningful, and transformational. That if we go through life trying to avoid making mistakes, we will never do it. Right? The mistakes will always be there. And if we're looking forward to a future of perfection, and there's going to be some arguments about whether that is in our future or not, but the notion that if we want to get rid of sin, if we want to get rid of failure, trying is never going to do it. But just maybe, and this is what I think the gospel tells us, just maybe, if I am committed and everyone is committed to loving people who make mistakes, we may be able to love them away. Right? Maybe it's 1,000,000 years from now, but I sort of believe this is the process that God has put at work, with Jesus coming not only to show us what it means to be human, and I would say that means loving your enemies, loving those people who are faulty and full of failures, but also I've totally lost my train of thought. This video was going so well until I got to this part. So the purpose of life, what it means to be truly human, is loving those people, loving your enemies, loving those people who are faulty. And through that process, we can eliminate that sin. And maybe we continue to make mistakes. Maybe we continue to be faulty. We have miscommunications. We do things inadvertently. I don't know. But through reconciliation, we can make that matter less. We can embrace the beauty of reconciliation, the beauty of what that means for our lives, in a way that overcomes sin and faults and failures. And that, to me, is what life is all about. We need to be loving in spite of faults and harms and traumas, and that love can drive out those things we hate. And I guess that's what I was saying, is that I believe that Christ came to show us how to be human, and that's what it means, and also to enable us to do that. And so it's not that we are earning salvation or that we are somehow responsible for the end of the world, but that God has gifted us, and that's true from the very beginning of creation. God has included us in this process of reconciliation, that God has made us the hands and feet, the instrument through which God brings true reconciliation to the world. And so those are my thoughts for the day. I hope that this video maybe is helpful to somebody, and that maybe I can make more of these in the future.